Apple has the richest quintile of users on the planet for the smartphone world. So anybody who's building an app wants to get access to the iPhone user base. In a sense, Apple doesn't have to play the game of building up enormous AI infrastructure in the cloud because someone will do it for them. Pretty easy for Apple to sort of select, the prettiest dress among these companies and to set up that sort of relationship. As other companies are spending tens and hundreds of billion dollars building up cloud networks, which require vast data centers running NVIDIA chips and all that kind of stuff, Apple isn't really playing that game. And I think they're probably right not to play that game. And I think the latest news is that Siri is likely to be powered by Google Gemini in the years to come.
애플이 개발을 안 하더라도 챗GPT라던가 아니면 이번에 지금 제미나이와 협력하듯이 그렇게 소프트웨어 AI 개발 회사들과 코어를 유지할 수 있다 이런 말씀이신가요?
Yeah, listeners may not know this, but Google pays Apple $20 billion a year just for Google to be the search engine, the default search engine on the iPhone. That's the sort of position that Apple's in. But I would say it's sort of the consensus that this is a massive bubble, and when it bursts, basically every company in the Magnificent Seven will be devalued and have all sorts of big, major investments on their balance sheet. And the main exception will be Apple. So however backward Apple looks right now, they might actually end up looking pretty 5-6 years from now. If it goes the other direction, then they're just going to get more and more behind. There's clearly a loss of innovation at the company, and it's just no better place to demonstrate that than in AI. And it's just embarrassing for Apple because AI is moving so quickly and they're not part of the conversation.
미국의 7대 빅테크, 이른바 M7 가운데 AI 발전에 있어 가장 뒤처진다는 평가를 받고 있는 애플이 여전히 전환점을 찾지 못하고 있다는 평가가 나왔습니다.
I don't know how much better Siri is today than in 2011 when it first came out. Look, Apple's not even really in the conversation when it comes to AI. They're not in the top 5. That would clearly be Google Gemini, OpenAI, ChatGPT, Anthropic, Perplexity, and maybe a French company like Mistral. Apple's just not there. It's probably not going to be controversial. I should point out, there's a video in the 1980s where Steve Jobs pontificates about the future of computing. And he imagines a time when you would be able to have a conversation with Aristotle about the meaning of life and teaching. I can pull out my phone right now and have a sort of mock conversation with Aristotle. The irony is that it's not with an Apple large language model. It's with 5, maybe 10 other different models, but none of them are Apple. Now, let me say the nice thing, which is Apple is probably smart not to be chasing the other big companies in spending tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars on massive data centers. Because with 1.5 billion iPhone users plus users on other Apple products, they're always going to be a business partner that any number of companies are going to want to look at. And so anybody with a leading large language model would love to have access to those 1.5 billion people. And it's not just the 1.5 billion, it's sort of who the 1.5 billion are. I don't think it's hyperbole to basically say Apple has the richest quintile of users on the planet for the smartphone world. So anybody who's building an app wants to get access to the iPhone user base. So in a sense, Apple doesn't have to play the game of building up enormous AI infrastructure in the cloud because someone will do it for them, and then Apple can just have a side agreement, a partnership to access that. For instance, ChatGPT can be embedded in the phone without Apple investing in the data centers, because ChatGPT will never have access to everything that Apple's capable of doing. Because ChatGPT is one app, it does not have access to other apps on your phone. Not in this sort of like sense of just having like a carte blanche, like I go anywhere, look for things. Siri does have that. So if they can do more and more of this on the chip rather than in the cloud, then they will be in a position that no other competitor within the iPhone universe will be able to be capable of. And so, as the owner, the monopolist of the operating system, the hardware and the software, basically, if Apple gets its stuff together, it is in prime position to do something dramatic and world leading with AI. And they are in prime position to do that because the chips that they fabricate with TSMC every year are absolutely world leading. And so if 2 or 3 years from now, they're able to get they're never going to be able to replicate entirely what's happening in the cloud and put it on the chip. But if you can answer all sorts of queries on the chip, wherein it has access to all of my emails, all of my photos, all of the things that you can think of that are on your phone, and that even in airplane mode, the chip is able to answer your queries by finding all of that information in a very personalized way, that would be brilliant.
You'll be able to ask Siri to find something when you can't remember if it was in an email, a text, or a shared note. Like some book recommendations that a friend sent you a while back.
I should note that Google is in the same position for the Android market. I don't know exactly what that means for Google operating with Samsung, but they could probably have a partnership that would allow Samsung to offer the same kind of thing. So to be clear, I don't mean on a world level leading smartphone stage, Apple's in a unique position. I just mean for the iPhone because they own the operating system, the hardware and the software. How that works out on the Android side is probably something I'd have to give more thought to, but it's just always worth reminding ourselves, however behind Apple is, they do sort of have this card to play. And when they successfully play that, they'll be in a great position.
이 책에서는 기술 안보의 시대에 애플의 강력한 경쟁자로 삼성의 행보에 더 주목하셨던 것 같아요. 이 두 기업의 전략을 비교를 했을 때 기술과 제조 전략이 어떤 차이가 있다고 보시나요?
The best way, I think, to explain Apple versus Samsung is to use a car analogy. Samsung is like Volkswagen. That Volkswagen is not just a brand, it's also a group. And it owns Porsche and it owns Audi. And the bulk of the profits and the bulk of the innovation are directed into Porsche and Audi. But the vast majority of the cars that the Volkswagen Group actually builds are much more lower end cars, right? If Volkswagen Group is going to make 10 million cars a year, I think 4 or 5 million are going to be the Volkswagen Golf. And it's a very small proportion that are going to be Porsches. That's a couple 100,000. And Samsung is a lot like that. So if I compare spec for spec the greatest or the latest Galaxy phone with the latest iPhone, it's a coin toss as to which one's going to be better, and it's probably just a taste preference between the two. It's not going to be the case that the iPhone is just obviously better or definitively better or something like that. The difference is that the iPhone is only playing at the top end. Apple is just creating Porsches or maybe Audis. So, it's true that Samsung produces more phones per year than Apple, but they're not, on the whole, the latest Galaxy phones. They're the lower end ones. So, again, I think this is something that people don't understand all the time. But if I was wrong about this, Samsung would have the same revenue as Apple, and they don't. And the famous statistic that is in my book, but is also elsewhere, it's a public stat, is that Apple produces only 20% of the world's phones. Samsung is actually about the same, but Apple takes 80% of industry profits. So it has vast implications, but the reason why Apple and Samsung are so different in market cap and revenue, despite making a similar number of phones, is that Samsung is up and down the whole gamut of quality levels in the same way that Volkswagen sells everything from the Golf to a Porsche 911. And Apple is not. Apple is only at the high end.
애플은 이제 제조 시스템을 중국의 한 곳에 집중을 했고 삼성은 다변화해가지고 제조 시스템을 만들었다고 표현을 하셨는데 근데 지금 이제 미국이 중국과 어떤 기술 패권, 무역 패권, 어떤 이제 싸우는 중에서 상대적으로 중국의 한 곳에 집중된 제조 시스템을 가지고 있는 애플이 지금 시대에 좀 불리해진 게 아닌가?
I mean, the simple answer is yes. I think Samsung probably has far more resiliency in building their phones than Apple does. Samsung has, 6 different locations across the world, from Argentina to Vietnam, for their production. Apple basically just has China. technically they do final assembly in India, but all the major production of the phone has already taken place by the time it gets to India, and that's all happened in China. The consolidation, I think, is vast and really difficult to overstate. People confuse this all the time, right? Because what they'll say is they'll read other reports and they'll deconstruct an iPhone and look at all the components and see where they come from. And it's true that it's often parts that from Korea, from Japan, from Taiwan, from America. But in so many cases, it's actually not from those countries. It's from companies that are headquartered in those countries who have set up shop in China. And Samsung is among the companies where that would be true. But so you're asking if Apple is in a more precarious position. And yeah, I mean, on the one hand, the fact that everything comes out of China means that Apple is in a precarious position. If there's an escalation in the US-China trade battle, then yeah, that makes everything really difficult for Apple. On the other hand, Apple is so big. You know, you think about like the 2008 banks that were too big to fail. Apple's a little bit like that. If you're Donald Trump, you really don't want to attack Apple for the simple reason that it is the most important, or maybe the second most important company in every voter's 401k. In other words, you've got 350 million Americans, any of them who are investing in index funds, in other words, just passively investing in the stock market. Apple is one of the greatest holdings. Historically, it has been the biggest holding for anybody in America for the last 14 years. So you wouldn't want to implement a policy that sort of directly impacts Apple's share price because you're sort of decreasing or denting the wealth of all of your constituents. So that actually sort of creates like a saving grace for Apple. The other thing is that tariffs are a pretty blunt policy move. And so when Washington, specifically Trump, has gone after China with tariffs, it's like reasonably simple. I don't want to overstate how simple it is, but in the grand scheme of things, it is not that difficult to just have the final step done in India. And for tariff purposes, that's a substantive change to the product. If you have a sub-assembled phone, go to Karnataka or Tamil Nadu, and then you just put the final thing together, send it off to people in America, suddenly that's a product, quote unquote, made in India. And so you've gotten around the tariff problem. And Apple's basically been able to do that for the iPhone, and it's done similar moves like AirPods and such for Vietnam. So as consolidated as they are, because tariff rules don't really have origin of country baked into their systems, it's actually pretty easy to get around that. A quote that I think about all the time is, where commerce doesn't cross borders, armies do. So there's this sense that commerce between countries is a really good thing, and it's an alleviating factor, and it brings mutual understanding between countries. Late 1990s, the New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman called this the Golden Arches theory of diplomacy when he pointed out that no two countries with McDonald's had ever gone to war. It's no longer true. I think it became no longer true when Russia invaded Ukraine. But as a general rule of thumb, it's not a bad framework. The problem was the vast over-consolidation into China, where Apple has no plan B. I mean, Apple does not manufacture products outside of China. They've got 30,000 people doing final assembly for Apple products in India. You've got 3 million people in China working on Apple products within a given year. So that's, the India number of people is 1%, right? 30,000 versus 3 million. So, I think my advice to Samsung or any Korean or any multinational company operating in China is not to get so taken by the efficiency, the higher margin, the lower cost, the scale possibilities that are possible in China. You have to continue doing things at home or in some other places. For Korean companies, it would just be, don't fall into the same trap, right? I mean, Supply Chain 101 would say you don't put all your eggs in one basket. Okay, cheers. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.